All right, chapter number 24, Industry Comes of Age. So this time span, 1865 to 1900, is more or less the same time span we saw in the last chapter. So last chapter really looked at the political side of things. This chapter we're looking at the economic side of things, and then next chapter, chapter 25, will be more of the social side of things. So, intro. At the end, rather, of the 19th century, so in the end of the 1800s, we really see the U.S., their industrial revolution really slipping into a higher gear. Okay, we had seen the industrial revolution a little bit in the Northeast with the textile industry, but now we're really seeing it take hold. The best men of the United States were now not seeking political office, but they were seeking profit. They didn't want to be in Congress, they wanted to be in a corporation. So we see a lot of shifts happening. We see a shift towards industry at the expense of agriculture, and we see a lot more exporting than importing. So a lot of changes, and this economic transformation is really achieved through foreign investments, labor, trade, technology. The United States was really becoming an economic force to be reckoned with. Section A. Section A, the iron colt, like a little baby horse, right, becomes the iron horse. The iron horse, of course, we're talking about is the railroads. The railroads are growing up in America. So, as an example, in 1865, the U.S. had 35,000 miles of track. Okay? In 1900, however, we had 192,556 miles of track. So that is actually more than all of Europe's railroads combined. So the United States railroad building was taking off. But the thing was, building a railroad was very, very expensive, and it was also quite risky. Okay, you could make a lot of money more or less overnight, but you could also lose a lot of money overnight as well. So the U.S., to encourage people to invest and to build railroads, they started to subsidize the railroads, or kind of help the railroad builders out a little bit. And they did this through two means. One, giving direct cash. So when all was said and done, the U.S. federal government gave about $49 million in direct cash. But the more likely situation, or the preferred method of subsidizing them, was something called land grants. Okay? Land grants is when the U.S. government would give railroad companies kind of a wide belt of land along the proposed route for the railroad. And they could use the land for two different things, right? Of course, they could use the land to actually build the railroad on. And also, they would be able to sell some of that land as well, and they could use that money to, one, build the railroad, or they could use that land kind of as collateral to be able to get some loans to build the railroad. So when all was said and done, the U.S. government gave 155,504,994 acres of land to railroads through this land grant, system. Yikes, that's a lot of land. In fact, that's more land than the whole state of Texas. Now you know. Okay? So, if you want to see more specifically how this land grant thing actually worked, there is a good map on page 567 that actually kind of explains it into more depth. So I'll let you look there. So critics of this land grant system argued that the federal government, was just like giving away all of this land to these greedy corporations. But, there's a couple of things you have to consider. Okay. One, a lot of this land that was given through the land grant system wasn't very valuable at all until the railroad showed up in town. Two, the federal government got really good rates on, post office things, the postal system, and they also got really good rates when it came to, moving around troops or moving around military supplies. So there was some benefit, of course, for the federal government in this as well. Something to keep in mind is that a lot of these frontier villages were really eager to get the railroad to come by their town or to pass through their town. Okay, because a lot of times if the railroad was built near a town, that town would kind of boom into a city. But if the railroad bypassed the town, that town a lot of times would be more or less a ghost town. People would just give up on it and leave. So, not surprisingly, a lot of towns would offer bribes to the builders of the railroads in order to get the privilege of being along the route. All right, section B, spanning the continent with rails. Fun, okay. So before in history, we talked about this a little bit, before the Civil War, there had been kind of the issue of where would the first transcontinental railroad be? Would it be in the north or would it be in the south? Well, guess what? The southern states seceded, and with that secession, they gave up their right to have the railroad in the south. So guess what? The first transcontinental railroad will be built in the north. And the beginning of the Civil War actually lent some urgency to the issue. They thought that if they were to build this transcontinental railroad, two things would happen. One, it'd be good for transportation, and two, it would also kind of bind or connect that gold-rich state of California even closer to the Union. All right, so in 1862, Congress finally commissions the Union Pacific Railroad to start building the Transcontinental Railroad, okay? So it's supposed to go west out of Omaha. All right, so here's what the subsidy would look like. For every mile of track laid, the company or the construction company would get 20 square miles of land to help build it. And they'd get a federal loan for anywhere between $16,000 to $48,000, just depending on the terrain. So they would get a bigger loan if they were, maybe blasting through some mountains versus just building over the prairies of, like Iowa. All right. So just to make it clear, when we're building this transcontinental railroad, right, we're actually building it from both sides. So we have a side, the group building east to west, and then we have a group building west to east. So the two sides will meet somewhere in the middle, okay? So let's first talk about the group that's headed towards California, or the group that's headed west. That group was the Union Pacific Railroad, like we just mentioned, and the people who really worked on the Union Pacific Railroad, heading west, that they were mostly Irishmen who had been veterans of the Civil War. So a lot of the Irish actually built at least part of the railroad. There was, a unit that had about 5,000 men, and one day they were able to build 10 miles of track. So they were really booking it, okay? They were working hard. Also, you have to realize once they started to reach further and further west into Indian Territory, a lot of times these Irish workers would bring along their rifles. So if Indians were to attack, they would switch their pixes or their axes for their rifles. So a score of both railroad workers and Indians died during the building of the railroad. Okay, these Irish workers oftentimes would live in kind of these tent towns. Up to 10,000 men would live together in these kind of tent towns, and the towns were called Hell on Wheels. Okay, 10,000 men, with your fair sprinkling of prostitutes and performers. All right. On the flip side, the group that was headed east, or headed from California over to Omaha, that group was the Central Pacific Railroad. So we have the Union Pacific headed west and the Central Pacific headed east. Okay. The Central Pacific was a little bit different. They were starting in Sacramento, California, and they were really financed by four men known as the Big Four. Among the Big Four, we have the ex-governor of California. He had a lot of political connections. His name was Leland Stanford. And then we also have a lobbyist. His name is Collis P. Huntington. And these four guys, the big four, ended up making tens of millions of dollars, and they operated through two different construction companies. But at least they had the sense not to bribe congressmen. Remember, in the East, we see that credit mobilier scandal, where people would be making a lot of money off of building the railroads, then bribing congressmen to, be quiet about it. Well, the same thing was really happening on the Central Pacific Railroad, but at least they had the sense not to bribe the congressmen, not to, get their hands too dirty. Anyway, the Central Pacific Railroad, instead of having a lot of Irish workers, they actually had a lot of Chinese laborers. And a lot of these guys, a lot of these Chinese men would actually die building these roads because the route headed west to east, they had to cut through the Sierra Nevada mountains. So they'd use a lot of dynamite, to blast their way through mountains. So it was a lot more dangerous for the Chinese that were, building for the Central Pacific Railroad. Anyway, the two lines finally met in the middle, or near the middle, in 1869 near Ogden, Utah. Okay, and there was a big ceremony, lots of pictures. They drove the final golden stake into the last rail. And when it's all said and done, the Central Pacific, the rail headed east, that created 689 miles. And then the Union Pacific, the railroad headed west, they built a lot more. They built 1,086 miles of track. All right. So some of the effects, we'll talk about these more later, but just for now, some of the effects we see a lot more trade with Asia, because California had always had this trade with Asia, but now that we're connected to California, we are kind of by default also further connected with Asia. We also see the welding of the West Coast, the rest of the Union, and we just see an increase in the population of the West in general. And America, they saw this completion of the Transcontinental Railroad as an achievement that would be equated to the Declaration of Independence or the emancipation of the slaves. This, my friends, was a big deal. All right. Section C, binding the country with railroad ties. You thought we were done talking about railroads, but we're not. Okay. So, by 1900, 4 other transcontinental railroads were built, okay? They had some subsidies, okay? They did get some land grants, but not nearly as much as the first one. We see in 83 the completion of the Northern Pacific Railroad. In 84, we see the completion of the Atchison, Topeka, San Francisco Railroad, and the Southern Pacific Railroad, and then in 93 we see the Great Northern Railroad be completed. So they're building. The thing is, a lot of railroad builders were kind of over-optimistic about things. A lot of them would kind of push into areas that didn't have enough population to really support the railroad, so a lot of times they would go bankrupt and kind of give up. So, they'd be building a railroad, headed in the middle of nowhere. They weren't super smart about it all the time. And we see this over and over again. Railroad lines would, pass through a number of bankruptcies, of mergers, of reorganization by the time, they were actually completed with building the railroads. All right. Section D, railroad consolidation and mechanization. All right. So a lot of the success we do see in the building of the Western Railroad lines come from really attaching to or expanding off of existing railroads that are already in the East. Okay, and we see a lot of success with this, specifically through a man named Cornelius Vanderbilt. Okay, Vanderbilt had been a millionaire. He made his fortune through the steamboat industry, but late in his 60s he decided, railroads, let's do that. So he starts to invest in railroads. And through this investment, he actually makes about $100 million, so very successful. And he made a couple of innovations. One of the things he did is his railroad, it's the New York Central, his railroad, they switched out the iron tracks and instead built with steel tracks. Okay, so that was good because steel was safer. It was also more economical because it would last longer, it was tougher, and it could bear more weight as well. Another innovation we see to the railroads is the standardization of the gauges of the track, or the distance between, or the width between the two tracks. I looked it up so you would know. And the standard distance between a typical railroad track in America is 4 feet 8.5 inches. You should measure it next time you're out and about. Watch out for trains. Anyway, so, they standardized the gauges because before, it'd kind of be a problem. If one railroad line was, this far apart, the next one was this far apart, you would constantly have to switch between the tracks. Another innovation was a better braking system. It was called the Westinghouse air brake. More efficient, more safe. You wouldn't overshoot the stations all the time now. We see also the Pullman Palace cars, and these were luxury cars kind of marketed as, gorgeous traveling hotels. But the problem with these palace cars was the fact that they had hanging and swinging kerosene lamps. So there was a very real danger there that they would catch on fire, and they did. Accidents in these railroad cars were reported almost daily. Anyway, Section E, the revolution by railroads, or railways. So, Section E is really how railroads changed the U.S. Okay, some of this will be repeating what I said before, but, the railroads really bound the U.S. together for the first time. It opened a lot of Western markets. So we see a lot of times goods from the West raw materials like lumber, that sort of thing, would travel east, and then a lot of the manufactured goods from the east would find its way west. Also, railroading became America's biggest business. It employed the most people. And about 20% of all investments made in the United States were actually investments in railroads. It really helped grow the steel industry, because after our friend Vanderbilt switched his tracks to steel tracks, people started to build with steel instead of iron. Also, we see a lot of farms kind of sprouting up along the railroad route, along with towns. It fostered the growth of cities because now that there's really good transportation, it's much more practical and a lot cheaper to, bring in food and to export all the manufactured goods that might be made in factories within the city as well. We also see an increase in immigration. Of course, immigration had been coming the whole time, but an increase in immigration because a lot of railroads would advertise, their land grant land in Europe, so they'd be like, come over to America, buy our land at a cheap price, change your life forever. Anyway, that sort of thing. Another thing not to be looked over was the, ecological change that happened, the land itself. So we see the prairies of Iowa, Illinois, Kansas, and Nebraska being plowed under, and instead we see, the rectangular shaped cornfields take its place. On the Dakotas in Montana, the, land of the buffalo was being overtaken by range-fed cattle. And then finally, in Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, a lot of those forests were being cut down and then transported to the plains, of Iowa, to help build towns and homes, that sort of thing. So we actually see a change in the land as well. Another really interesting thing that happens is actually the change in time. And this is what I mean. Before, back in the day, each town had its own local time based on where the sun was. So you might start out in Detroit, and in Detroit it's 12:20. Then you get to Chicago, and in Chicago it's noon. And then you get to St. Louis. In St. Louis it's 11:50. So each location had its own local time. Well, this wasn't very efficient when it came to trying to coordinate schedules with the railroads. And, they wanted also to avoid crashes, that sort of thing. So what they did is in 1883, some of the major railroads kind of came together and decreed that there would be 4 time zones. So this wasn't really even an act of Congress. This was something that originated in the railroads. They said there'll be 4 time zones across the United States so we can at least make sense out of a little bit what is the time. So, most communities actually adopted that fairly quickly. All right, so that was one of the changes we see in the railroads. All right, Section F, wrongdoing in railroading. What is that I smell? I smell corruption. Oh, okay, Section F is all about the corruption with the railroads. Okay, so when fortunes can be made overnight, corruption is going to happen. We've already seen some ways that people had been trying to make $1 off of the railroad. We see people, making money off of the construction companies. We saw the Credit Mobilier scandal where they would overcharge and pocket the remainder of the money. We say Jay Gould, the guy who had tried to corner the gold market. Well, he's back, and he spends about 30 years, booming and busting railroad stocks. How this would happen is something called stock watering. What they would do is railroad stock promoters would make these inflated claims about the railroad line's assets, about the actual value or the profitability of the stock. So they would sell the stock at a price that far exceeded the line's or the stock's true value. So that was another way people made money off of the railroads. And we really see the, titans of industry, the railroad titans, they're really out for profits, right? They kind of trampled upon the public interest. They more or less ignored the laws when they wanted to. They would bribe judges. They would bribe legislators. They would kind of have their own puppets or their own men elected to political office so they could do whatever they wanted. They'd give free passes or free, fare on their railroad lines to anyone who was a journalist or anyone who was a politician, to try to get them on their side, that sort of thing. And we see these kind of railroad titans becoming extremely powerful. They manipulated this huge monopoly, which was the railroad industry. And some argued that these railroad titans had more direct control over Americans than the president did. Okay, very, very powerful. And here's the deal. Instead of working against each other, what the railroads started to do is they started to work together. Okay, for example, they would create pools. Another word for that would be cartels, right? So in these pools, they would divide business in a given area and then share the profits. So they would work together as opposed to being each other's competitors. So instead of having competition and forcing the prices or the rates down, they worked together and set the price and enjoyed the profits. Another thing they would do is they would give rebates or kickbacks to the big shippers in return for their business. So in the long haul, what happens is small farmers would actually pay the most for using the railroad, while the big guys, the big shippers, got the deals. So that wasn't super fair for the small farmers. So we see a lot of corruption here, Section F, in the railroads. All right, Section G. Government bridles the iron horse. Okay, so we want to see some regulation happening here, right? These railroad titans, they shouldn't be able to get away with all that corruption. So many people, really felt they were at the mercy of these railroad titans. And, Americans had been very quick to respond to political injustice but they were more reluctant or slower to respond to economic injustice. And this is kind of why. At that time, the ideal was a free market, right? Competition, free enterprise. Jefferson's ideas of really separating government for business, that was really the American ideal at the time. And plus, it's the American dream that anyone could become the next millionaire. So people were really slow to really demand or seek, some regulation to all of this business going on. All right. However, when the Depression set in the 1870s, we talked about it last chapter, a lot of the farmers in the western states started to complain and started to want to see some reform within their states. Okay, so state legislators started to attempt to regulate the railroad monopoly in their states, but their efforts to change or to make changes within their states was stopped when the Supreme Court came out with the case called Wabash St. Louis and the Pacific Railroad Company versus Illinois. And this Supreme Court case declared that individual states couldn't regulate interstate commerce, aka states can't mess with the railroads because the railroads go through more than one state. Okay, so now it was up to the federal government to do the job of passing regulations. So what Congress passes was called the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887. So the Interstate Commerce Act made some reforms, including they said, no, you can't give kickbacks, no, you can't have cartels or pools. They said you can't discriminate against certain shippers. You have to publish your rates somewhere. You can't charge more for short hauls than for long ones, which kind of equated to, remember, farmers would have more of the short hauls and the big shippers would have the longer hauls. So they're trying to make it fairer for the small farmers. Okay, and then to regulate these new rules, they set up something called the ICC, or the Interstate Commerce Commission. Okay, the Interstate Commerce Commission, what they were doing is, is the first federal regulatory agency, designed to protect the public interest against, these big trusts that were forming, or the railroad companies. So it was really the federal government's first attempt at regulating the railroads. So the Interstate Commerce Commission was kind of interesting because, as there's a lawyer, his name was Richard Olney, said, he concluded that the law, or the Interstate Commerce Act, could actually help the railroads because it gave the public this image of government regulation, but in reality the law actually did very little to enforce these regulations. So this Interstate Commerce Act, it was a good idea, it was the step in the right direction, but the Interstate Commerce Commission just didn't really have the power to enforce this very well. The only thing it really did is kind of gave that illusion that the government was doing something about it. All right. I think with that, that is enough for this video.